please give a big round of applause to Brian A. Catlos in conversation with William Dalrymple. Brian and William are both going to be signing their books after the session outside their bar hole in the book signing area. Grab your copies and line up there. Thank you. After the session.
As some of you may know, Jaipur has now a growing galaxy of satellites, and the oldest and the largest is in Boulder, Colorado, and it was there that we met Brian Catlos, who was the star of one of our early Boulder festivals, Boulder Jaipur Festival. And having been dazzled by Brian there, I took his new book, Kingdoms of Faith, to Granada last New Year and read it in the Alhambra and in Seville and on the road between there and the Alpujarras Mountains. And it is a dazzling book. And I could just be a straightforward sales pitch. Go out of this room at the end of this session and go and buy it, because it's by a long way the most wonderful book I read last year. And I chose it in the Wall Street Journal as my book of the year, and I could not recommend it more. It's an absolute model of how deeply scholarly history can be made accessible, fascinating, opening your eyes to a whole range of new topics. And I think when I went to Spain last New Year, I brought a pile of books this high, and in the end, this was, in a sense, all you needed was everything was here. Anyway, after that sales pitch, Brian, open the story with an image of what's happening in Spain as the Roman Empire is crumbling and the barbarians are at the gates.
So what we have with the Arabic expansion, not only in Spain but across the Near East and the Mediterranean, is something of a historical accident, in that Islam and Muhammad arrived on the scene historically precisely at the moment that the two great empires of the Western world, the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, were collapsing under the weight of their own inertia and centuries-long conflict that they had had. And so one can see the Arabo-Islamic expansion as either the beginning of something new or as one of the last waves of the barbarian invasions that had been weakening, particularly the Western Roman Empire, over the previous couple hundred years. And this is really one of the secrets to the success of Islam as a political and military force in those centuries. The other part of their success was the Arabs' ability and their necessity to engage with the people that they were conquering. The Arabs were a very small people. They weren't at this point very sophisticated in terms of running an empire, and so they very quickly learned that in order to conquer the territory that they wanted to, in order to impose this new religious, cultural, social system on the people around them that they were developing, that they had to engage productively with the people they were conquering. And so this is something that typifies the Islamic expansion from the beginning. So in the late 600s, within a few decades of the death of Muhammad, incredibly, virtually all of the Persian Empire had been conquered by this small band of primitive warriors, and they headed westwards. They headed through Egypt, they headed through North Africa. In North Africa, they encountered Berber peoples. Berbers were a bit of a special case for them. Berbers were a lot like Arabs culturally, semi-nomadic, nomadic, warrior people. The difference was that unlike the people they encountered in the Near East, Berbers were pagans, and this is where Islam drew the line. Christians, Jews, even Zoroastrians could be incorporated as legitimate subjects into the Islamic social and legal and cultural system, but pagans were beyond the pale. And so as far as the Berbers went, for the Arabs it was to fight them until either the death or conversion. And what happened was, as the Arab armies gradually rolled their way across North Africa, what they found was that most of the Berbers ended up converting. And what this did was it reconstituted what had become a tiny Islamic army into a much larger force.
My great hero of medieval history, Sir Stephen Runciman, makes a fabulous case for something which is very counterintuitive to everything I was brought up with. We used to obviously look on Islam and the Arabs as something enormously foreign, possibly something slightly worryingly dangerous and hostile. But he makes the case that in many ways the civilization of Cordoba, the civilization of Damascus, the Umayyad Caliphate, continued the civilization of the Romanized world, a world of bathhouses, a world of education, a world of courtyard houses and large estates, and that the break was the barbarians who became the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks and so on.
Absolutely. The Arabic expansion had been presaged by centuries of integration of Arabs within the Roman and Persian world. And we can see it in the architecture of the early Islamic world in the Near East. If you look at, for example, the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, the Dome of the Rock.
A former legionary fortress.
Exactly, and they are not only essentially Roman monuments, they were also built by Greek and Roman craftsmen, deploying the same techniques and motifs that they had used previously, because these were the things that Arabs knew. Now, when the Arabs got to Al-Andalus, when the Muslims got to Al-Andalus, what they encountered there was another group of barbarians who had kind of glommed on to this Roman culture in a much more kind of primitive way, because they had come from a much more isolated area. And what's interesting was that from the beginning, from the outset, these Arabs were not seen as exotic foreigners. What they were seen as another player in the game. And the Visigothic kingdom of Spain, the kingdom of Spain that the Muslims conquered, was at this time rift by a civil war between two noble factions. And very quickly, the Arabs became aligned with one of these noble factions. And so it's not so much a story of an outright invasion, but of someone opening the door and letting them in.
And who are the Visigoths?
Well, the Visigoths were your sort of textbook Germanic barbarians who had sacked Rome in the late 4th century and eventually settled down in Spain and the south of France and had established a kingdom. But it wasn't a very stable kingdom. It was a kingdom because of the nature of power in these barbarian kingdoms. Barbarians are very individualistic, very freedom-loving. They don't like authority. And there are very many nice things about that, but one of the consequences is there are always battles to see who is in charge. So it was inherently unstable, and it was this instability that gave the Arabs the opportunity to come in.
And Gibraltar is named after who?
Well, Gibraltar is named after Tariq ibn Ziyad, who is a very... Jabal Tariq, which means the mountain of Tariq. And he's an interesting character because he kind of epitomizes this synthesis. Tariq ibn Ziyad was himself a Berber. His father had been captured and enslaved and had converted to Islam, but had the good fortune to be enslaved by a powerful Arab family. And so he was incorporated into that family and became a trusted member of it. This is the way slavery worked in the Islamic world. It wasn't chattel slavery, plantation slavery. It was the sort of slavery in which if you were enslaved by a powerful family, you became part of that family and you identified with it.
And which was brought here by the Delhi Sultanate. So Qutb ad-Din Aybak is a slave who rises to be a sultan.
Absolutely, absolutely. Slavery kind of counterintuitively becomes this amazing institution for expanding and integrating native peoples into Islam. It was also very brutal, particularly for women. We can't skirt around the issue. Concubinage, the forced enslavement of women was brutal and terrible. So I don't want you to think, as I describe this in the sort of detached terms of a historian, that I'm recommending it.
So I don't think anyone took that reading. So the Arabs crossed to Gibraltar and very quickly reach up and indeed reach beyond the Pyrenees. They go up into what's now southern France, where finally they're turned back by Charles Martel.
Absolutely, and this is one of the most overrated episodes in Western civilization. So to give you the pocket version, the Muslim army under Tariq ibn Ziyad manages in one battle to defeat the entire army of the Visigoths. So Spain and southern France are left essentially defenseless. And so very quickly they pour through Spain, town by town, negotiating the surrender of every town. Basically, the deal they offer is, if you surrender, then you can keep your possessions, you can practice your religion, all we want is to take some taxes, right? If you resist us, We will attack you, we will enslave you, and we will take all your things. So very quickly they established themselves in Spain. And it's really a question of absolute luck. There was no master plan to conquer Europe, because Europe was nothing at this time. There was not even a conception of Europe. And Northern Europe was this poor, barbaric backlot. And so when they reached, they kept raiding, and at one point, an individual named Charles Martel managed to issue them their first significant defeat, after which the Muslim armies pulled back to the south of France. Now, subsequent historians like Gibbon built this up as this moment in which Europe was saved and in which...
Can you do that passage?
I can't remember the whole thing, but Gibbon said...
But for Charles Martel, we may yet have the Quran of Muhammad dictated from the pulpits of Oxford.
To a circumcised student body. And he said that, it's the distance from Damascus to Gibraltar is less than the distance from Gibraltar to the Thames. And that always kind of reminded me of the speech that Ronald Reagan, I don't know if any of you guys remember him, made a long time ago about Nicaragua. And he said, Nicaragua is closer to Texas than Texas is to Washington. Well, that may be true, but it makes no sense. And the fact is, the Arabs were just expanding because they could get away with it. So as soon as they got one defeat, they were so few in number that they realized they had to pull back, and that's what they did.
Some historians have also said that really there was no reason for them to bother with France, as it was just a barbaric wasteland full of French people.
Well, the nice thing about France was, exactly. The nice thing about France and the Christian lands that made them such a tempting target was they had these things called churches. And the European kings in the barbarian period had a habit of keeping all their money in churches. And they didn't guard them because they didn't have to, because people wouldn't attack churches. And that was fine if everyone was Christian. But these Muslims came along and they're like, wow, there are these stone buildings which are full of gold and jewels, and they're guarded by people who don't have weapons and won't defend themselves. So this became the sort of modus operandi and what drew them north. It wasn't any grand plan to establish Islam as...
Again, a similar process drawing them into Sind.
Absolutely. Well, as a historian, I can tell you, follow the money, and you can't really go wrong.
So they take Spain, a border is established more or less with the Pyrenees, although there's an outlying Arab island off the coast of Cannes ready for the film festival.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well, that happened a little bit later. There was a second wave of Arabo-Islamic mischief happening not far from Cannes in a place called Freixenet, or Fréjus, where they set up a sort of little base for which they could raid inland into France.
Capturing film stars on their way in the red carpet.
Exactly, and at one point they made it as far as Switzerland. Maybe they were going for the duty-free or something. They sacked the library at St. Gall, and I believe they kidnapped briefly the abbot or a pope, I can't remember quite what. But it's interesting because that provoked an important diplomatic incident between the rulers of Germany, who were the Holy Roman Emperors, and the emirs of Cordoba. And there was quite a diplomatic to and fro with the Holy Roman Emperor, demanding that these pirates be reined in, and the emir of Cordoba saying, well, I can't really do anything. And, they're their own people.
So back in Spain, behind the frontier, conversion, integration, the Visigoths convert, but many do not, and many Jews do not convert.
Absolutely. The interesting thing is we have this idea, that the Arabo-Islamic conquest, again, was intended to transform the world into an Islamic world. But particularly in the early period, the Arab Muslims weren't that interested in converting people to Islam. They preferred people to belong to other religions, because basically the fewer Muslims there were, the more power and prestige every Muslim had.
And the higher the tax.
There was also the issue that non-Muslims paid slightly higher taxes than Muslims. So,
which was also an important reason why in this country, conversion in the early centuries, certainly.
Absolutely.
It's only in the 18th century that you get mass conversion.
Often it was explicitly discouraged. Plus, the emirs of the rulers of Al-Andalus, the emirs and later the caliphs, they were very canny politically, and they knew that the secret to their success, to maintaining their power, was dividing their population. So it worked very well for them to have a population that consisted of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, because the Christians and Jews could not threaten them directly politically. And so what they would do is they would empower these minority communities as a way of diluting the power of the Muslim community, which could pose a threat to them. It's the same kind of dynamic that we saw in the 20th century in places like Syria, Okay, this is the political game. So what we often see as being tolerance, in some ways it was tolerance, but in many ways it was just a political strategy in order to maintain the power of the elite by empowering minorities and therefore giving them a balance to the majority population.
In your book, you slightly try and push back on the sort of the golden age myth that this was Al-Andalus under Cordoba was this sort of perfect kingdom where Jews and Christians and Muslims loved each other to death, and yet there is a basis for seeing it as an extraordinary moment in history.
Well, you know what they say, every age is a golden age for those who have the gold, and that was that was certainly true in Al-Andalus. So, the interesting thing was, and the sort of happy byproduct of this perhaps Machiavellian dynamic of empowering the minorities was that it contributed to the existence of an open and cosmopolitan society. And for me, in my experience as a historian, the more open and cosmopolitan and quote-unquote tolerant, which is a word I don't like, societies are, the more they advance. And that was certainly the case in Cordoba. And Cordoba soon went from being this provincial backwater that was looked down and despised within the Islamic world as being, the land of country bumpkins, soon became the epicenter of an Islamic civilization that incorporated not only Roman, Greek, African, and Persian influences, but also influences from as far away as India.
Talk about that. Well, how far did Indian, so what we call Arabic numerals in the West, but which are in fact Indian numerals, algebra and so on. This is all Indian learning coming for the first time into Europe.
Absolutely, and the Arabic numerals are a really good example of how that process happened. So the first sort of area of the Islamic world which became really cosmopolitan and super powerful was the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Baghdad, which of course doesn't look westward but looks eastward, and very quickly became involved in India through conquest, communication, and trade. And as a consequence, the Arabs, the Muslims, were very open to incorporating whatever innovations they could, adapted all sorts of things that they found in India. Things like astrology and astronomy, numbers, different products, different foods, all sorts of technical things, and that went into transforming this culture in Baghdad, this golden age culture of the Islamic world.
Medicine too.
What's that? Medicine, absolutely. Yeah. Virtually every field of science that you can think of. It's really incredible. Medicine, biology, botany, agronomy, the list goes on.
So who's translating the Sanskrit texts from India into Arabic, and where's that happening?
That's happening again. It's happening in Baghdad and also in the independent eastern kingdoms of the Abbasid Caliphate. Places like Bukhara, which is another kind of strategically located...
Ghazni?
Exactly, yeah. Ghazni. All of these places set up their own little courts in emulation of the court of Baghdad. The thing is, once knowledge came to be recognized as something which was not only useful, but something which was emblematic of power and prestige, everyone wanted to do it. So every little court had a library. Every petty king sought out to have mathematicians, astrologers, astronomers, scientists, and this contributed to this culture of science.
And so Mahmud of Ghazni, who has such a bad reputation in India for looting Somnath and so on, it encourages to his little sultanate in southern Afghanistan, Al-Biruni, who then goes down here to India, talks to the Brahmins, learns Sanskrit, comes back and sort of talks about the wonders of India, but also the fact that he has this wonderful phrase. He says the Indians think the only learning is their learning, the only history is their history, and the only art is their art.
Well, that could be said about just about anyone. But getting back to this individual, Aristotle said the difference between comedy and tragedy is distance, and history is something similar. So, we admire these figures who become these cultural giants, these transformative giants, but, they were really nasty people. We can't forget that. Their whole power was predicated on conquest and violence. So it's kind of an interesting thing that we as historians and human beings have to balance out before we start getting too nostalgic about these people.
So before we move back sort of fully to Spain, so how is the learning getting from Ghazni and Tashkent, all these Sanskrit texts, how are they making their way to Cordoba?
Well, another fortunate series of accidents, which is often what drives history. What happened was, for various reasons, some of which were climactic and some of which were demographic and some of which were political, the Abbasid Caliphate went into a series of important political crises in the 800s. Now, what had happened in the meanwhile was the Islamic world had been established as this politically disunified but culturally unified world that stretched from the Indus River to the Atlantic. Everyone there spoke Arabic, or at least the learned people did. Islamic law was respected throughout this whole area, and so it made the possibility of great mobility. So as the court in Baghdad collapsed, all of these learned people, all of these musicians, artists, scientists needed to find some place where they could set up shop. And for them, because they spoke Arabic, most of them were Muslim, and they were attuned to Arabic culture, they could simply move over to Spain. And so Spain inherits the culture that had developed in Baghdad in the Golden Age, and it kind of springs up there again.
So give me a little picture of Cordoba at its height, at the peak of its cultural power.
Well, the way I like to do that is usually I like to compare it to contemporary European cities, because we think of the great European cities like London and Paris. Now, London and Paris, if we look back to the 9th century, probably had no more than 12 or 20,000 inhabitants. Absolutely filthy, no infrastructure, very few stone buildings even in London and Paris. And then we compare it to Cordoba. And this is something that medieval travelers from Northern Europe were very impressed by. You get to Cordoba, and Cordoba probably had a population, we're not sure, it's often exaggerated, but certainly around the 250,000 mark, okay? One city, 250,000.
10,000 for London, 250,000 for Cordoba.
Exactly. Paved streets, street lighting, sewage, infrastructure, market inspectors. This is all the kind of basis. And on top of that, you had a society which was a commercial monetary society which could sustain an extremely high level of culture, okay? Because the people in power were interested in promoting that. And it attracted people from all over the world. So it was the kind of place where you could rub elbows with people from Africa, from Central Asia, from Persia, from Northern Europe, many of whom could speak the same language, and all of whom were engaged in the same sort of cosmopolitan spirit.
And again, we tend to think of the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages as being a period of sort of, of great provincialism. And yet, Charlemagne in Aachen is in correspondence with Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad.
Absolutely, absolutely. The ties between the various Christian princes and the Byzantine Emperor and the Islamic caliphs and princes around the Mediterranean were intense from the beginning, and the Christians really felt they had something to gain because they were aware of the power and prosperity and sophistication of this world they were confronted with. This is the reason why kings sent gifts to each other. It wasn't because they liked each other. Sending a gift was a way of impressing someone. So when Charlemagne receives an elephant and a clock from Harun al-Rashid, the first thing he's going to think is, I better be this guy's friend, because if he's got elephants, then he could cause me no end of trouble.
And presumably the elephant came from here originally.
The elephant, I guess originally it would have come from here.
It's a long journey.
It survived a long time too. Charlemagne was very sad when he died. It was noted in his chronicles.
So, and give me a whiff of the intellectual and artistic culture in Cordoba.
Well, the intellectual and artistic culture was, I'll give you another contrast. St. Gall, which is this monastery in Switzerland that I mentioned earlier, the library of St. Gall around the year 900 or so probably had 100 books, okay?
Founded by an Irishman.
Well, there you go. You're not going to feel proud of that when you hear about Cordoba. So the Caliphal Library at Cordoba, we think probably had close to 100,000 volumes in it. Okay? And that was only one library because all of the members of the elite set up their own libraries and research institutions in a way to imitate and rival it. So it became a hothouse of intellectual activity, and one that was, as I said, what's striking is the cosmopolitanism. You didn't have to be a Muslim to play. You kind of had to be a man, although we find traces of women who are also engaged in this intellectual culture as well, as librarians, as poetesses, sometimes as religious thinkers as well. So, it's this openness which is really the source of its success.
And there's one moment when they send an embassy to Constantinople, and the Byzantine emperor sends some books in Greek to Cordoba.
Absolutely.
And they find a Jewish doctor who can read Greek. It's then translated by a Christian, I think. You know the story, but
Exactly. I mean, it's
Dioscordes,
crazy in its complexity, but this is a good example. One of the main medical books in the Byzantine Empire was Dioscordes' Book of Simples, which is a kind of encyclopedia of medical ingredients. And it was sent, a Greek copy was sent to Cordoba as a gift, as one of these diplomatic gifts. So they had to find someone to translate it from Greek. This got the attention of the Caliph's personal physician, who was a gentleman named Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who happened to be a Jew, an accomplished physician, a rabbi, and not only the Caliph's personal confidant, but also a high member of the civil service. In fact, the Caliph rewarded him with the title of Chief Customs Inspector, which made him incredibly rich because he collected all the customs duties. Hasdai ibn Shaprut, and this is a really interesting story, he started functioning as a sort of Jewish shadow caliph. And just as the Caliph of Cordoba presented himself as the sovereign of Muslims all over the world, Hasdai ibn Shaprut began to present himself as the Nasi, the prince of the Jews of all of the world, and started to carry out his own foreign policy. He sent envoys on his own, Jewish envoys, to Constantinople to seek contact with the legendary Jewish Khazar kingdom in Central Asia. So it's an incredibly complex and connected world. When we think of this as being a world which is divided between Christianity and Islam, it just is not a picture that holds when we look at the connections people were
Just
making.
because it's such a good story, give me 1 minute on the Khazars, because they're...
Well, the Khazars. So Azaria was a Jewish kingdom that existed in Central Asia from about the 800s.
It's so incredibly cool, a Jewish kingdom in Central Asia.
And there were a number of Muslim visitors who went to it. We can read their accounts of it, which are absolutely fascinating. But how did the Jewish kingdom end up in the Caucasus in the 8th century? Well, the story is that they were barbarians and pagans, like everyone else started out as. And as the Abbasid Caliphate became powerful, the Abbasid Caliphate was Islamic. The Byzantine Empire, the other world power, was Christian. And, if you're a barbarian, everyone's looking at you like, that's not a good thing to be. We're going to attack you. So they had to find a religion. And they had to find a religion which would be respected. But if they converted to Islam, then they would sort of come under the power of the Caliph of Baghdad. If they converted to Christianity, they would kind of come under the power of the Byzantine Emperor. So they chose Judaism, right? As a way of legitimizing themselves without coming in under anyone's power. It's the same way that Yemen became a Jewish kingdom in the 5th century. But the story is funny, so if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you the story. So the story is that what the king did was he invited basically a representative of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to debate. And they held a debate, and this is how he decided to become Jewish. Again, it's a prosaic story, but I think he was really thinking about the politics of the situation.
Stephen Greenblatt or the Simon Schaumer of the day was there.
Exactly.
Winning the battle. So in Cordoba, this incredible culture is going, and yet on the frontiers in the Pyrenees, Roland is blowing his Oliphant. The Reconquista is beginning.
Well, yes and no. The Reconquista is supposedly beginning, but the stories we get of the Reconquest, for example, the story of Roland. So what the story is that Charlemagne came down to conquer Islamic Spain, and he showed up, and he was supposed to be allied with one of the Muslim kings, and the Muslim king changed his mind. So as Charlemagne was taking his army back to France, they were treacherously attacked by these monstrous, hideous Saracens. And Roland, who was one of Charlemagne's champion warriors,
in charge of the rear guard,
saved the day by blowing his horn, Oliphant, an elephant tusk, and so hard that he actually literally blew his brains out through his ears, but thereby saved the day. This becomes the national epic of France. So the national epic of France,
Chanson de Roland.
Chanson Roland, is framed around a conflict between Christianity and Islam. Now, it was based on a true story, but the story was that Charlemagne was indeed invited down to Muslim Spain to become an ally of one of the kings who wanted to become independent, right? And indeed, the Muslim king, changed his mind. So Charlemagne had to take his armies back into France, and he did indeed cross through the pass of Roncesvalles, but it wasn't Muslims who attacked him. It was the Basques. So later it became conflated with the struggle against Islam when really the Muslims didn't have anything to do with it.
Very good. But anyway, by the 10th century, by the 11th century, there are now serious inroads into northern Spain. You get the first Spanish kingdoms being formed in northern Spain.
Absolutely. And so we have a situation where the Muslims, for political reasons, couldn't directly dominate all of the Iberian Peninsula. And so they either were forced to or they allowed these little pocket Christian kingdoms to exist basically as tributaries along their frontier. And again, that's pretty good political policy to have a buffer zone around you, particularly because they could control these kingdoms. They often married into the royal families of these kingdoms. These Christian kings would send their daughters to be married into the families of the emirs and the caliphs, which brings us to a really interesting point. If you think about it on those terms, on genealogical terms, the royal families of Christian and Muslim Spain were members of the same larger family. They were all related to each other. Most of the caliphs were the sons of Christian women who had either been enslaved or noble women who had been given in marriage to these Muslim
Again,
kings.
a very close parallel with the Rajputs and the Mughals.
Absolutely.
Where all the Mughals, from the point of Jahangir onwards, are the son of Rajput women.
This is pre-modern imperialism 101. I mean, this is the way it works. The flip side was that once the caliphate became weak, once it collapsed under its own political weight and began to falter, this was the opportunity then for these kingdoms to take the offensive. Okay, and later, again, it was framed in religious terms, but when we read the texts of the time and we analyze the politics of the time, it's clear that the whole religious thing is not a motivator. It's rather a way that later people make sense out of political events that have happened for other reasons.
And so Christian kingdoms begin to roll down. Barcelona is taken. Christian kingdoms come further. Even Cordoba is taken. And yet, this isn't a time of decay and disintegration in what's left of Al-Andalus. This, in many ways, is the peak culturally.
Absolutely. There's a curious disengagement, it seems, sometimes of politics and culture. And we see this across the Mediterranean world, and I think across Western Asia as well, that sometimes, even though kingdoms are politically weak, they can be culturally very dynamic. And this is what happened to Islamic Spain. When the caliphate fell in 1030, and it was not conquered by Christians, it fell as a consequence of civil war and interior pressures, what happened was not the extinction of Islamic culture in Al-Andalus, but instead the blossoming of it. The embers of the torch that Cordoba was when it struck the ground were scattered across Al-Andalus. And all of a sudden, instead of there being one capital city, there were now 12 capital cities, all competing with each other for greater glory and prestige, each cultivating learning, science, culture, literature. And as the Christians came into contact with these kingdoms, they appreciated the value that they had too. And they didn't try to stamp them out. They didn't try to destroy them. They tried to control them, and then they tried to co-opt them. Even when they conquered them, the aim was not to expel the Muslims, only to take them over politically.
And perhaps the most dramatic example of that is Seville. Which, I mean, we're now talking, the Christian kingdoms are now marching down towards Gibraltar. Seville is very far to the south. But you get there a Christian kingdom which is more Arabicized and more Islamicate in the sense of culturally Islamic, despite its Christian faith.
By the time we get to the year 1250, in terms of what we might call free Islamic Spain or independent Islamic Spain, there's only one kingdom left, the Kingdom of Granada in the south of the peninsula. And again, the history often presents it, this idea of reconquista, of reconquest, as the Christian kings being determined to stamp out Islam in the peninsula. But in reality, there was a hiatus of 250 years. Between 1230 and 1480, there was no real interest in conquering the Kingdom of Granada. And Granada developed a symbiotic relationship with the Kingdom of Castile that operated on all kinds of levels, politically, militarily, and culturally. So if you go to Seville, you can go to the Alcázar, the castle of Seville, the Royal Alcázar, and you'll go to it and you'll look at this palace and you'll say, my goodness, this palace looks like the Alhambra. And they must have copied the Alhambra of Granada.
And used the same, they even used the same masons.
Absolutely, but guess what? The Alcázar was built first. And it was the Alhambra which was the imitation of the Alcázar. And that just shows to you the degree to which these two cultures, at least on certain levels, were in tight collaboration and synthesis.
And the Alhambra is a perfection in a sense of the...
Well, certainly the Muslims would say that. It's definitely a perfection of anything the Christians did.
And what was the guy called in Seville? Peter the Cruel. Peter the Cruel.
Very, very nasty king. Not a very nice guy. And someone whose political future, because he ended up being so hated by his own people, that's his nickname, Peter the Cruel, that really his political survival depended on cultivating his allies within this Muslim kingdom. And so we got this situation where we have battles all across the Iberian Peninsula in which the two sides are not Christians versus Muslims, but it's always a mixture. There's always Christians and Muslims on both sides. And this is true right through the era of the Reconquest. So when Peter the Cruel is fighting his final battles as he struggles to hold on to the crown of Castile, which he loses, incidentally, when his half-brother Henry Trastamara stabs him, as he's struggling to hold on to his kingdom, among his most loyal soldiers are the cavalrymen that have been sent up from Granada to aid him. So this is a total inversion of the way that we're often taught about this history and the way we're trained to think about it.
And where does El Cid fit into all this?
Well, El Cid is another one of these fascinating characters, and one of these characters who's become a sort of a mirror of different people's aspirations and ideals.
In case people don't know who he is.
So El Cid, forget Charlton Heston, okay? That version of the Cid story was invented about 150 years after the Cid's death and has very little to do with history. So as the Caliphate of Cordoba was collapsing, the Iberian Peninsula became this sort of free-for-all, a great land of opportunity if you had a sword and you were willing to use it. And the Cid was a noble from Castile who ended up being exiled from his own kingdom for political reasons and became a mercenary, a very successful mercenary who served defending the Muslim kingdoms against the Christian attackers. Until eventually he decided that it was time to strike out on his own, and he conquered the city of Valencia and established his own kingdom. He was a hero at the time. People would literally sing songs about him around the campfire. Very quickly he got turned into this kind of paradigmatic figure of the Reconquista, a Christian crusader, a holy warrior. And, although the Cid certainly thought of himself as Christian, and there was an element of that, he was actually a man of his time in that he was after power. And he was prepared to deal with anybody, to govern anybody, and make treaties with anybody as long as it reinforced his own agenda.
So let's now focus on the final days of Granada. The Catholic kings are now united. They've closed in from all sides, and it's only Granada left on the far south of Al-Andalus.
Again, as happens so often in history, the Kingdom of Granada was really a victim of its own debilities as much as it was of the people who were attacking it. Again, this was a situation where the political environment within the Kingdom of Granada had become toxic. You see, one of the strategies, as you know from Indian history, one of the features of Islamic law and culture is that men are allowed to marry up to 4 women, right? And rich men usually did, and they usually had lots of concubines too. Now, one of the good things, one of the benefits of that policy was if you were a king, it ensured that you would probably have a functional male heir, right? And this was important for the continuity of the kingdom. But the problem is you often had many functional male heirs. And this gave rise to a political environment in which particularly the mothers of your heirs, who were different women, would engage in political games in order to ensure that their son came to the throne.
Again, very much in the Mughal.
It wasn't
Jahangir,
because,
Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb. Yeah.
Exactly. It wasn't because they were bad people. Their lives often depended on it, and the lives of their children. So there was a sort of death struggle going on within the palace. And when that blew up, it was something that outsiders could take advantage of. So Fernando and Isabella, who had married and joined the 2 great kingdoms of Spain, Aragon and Castile, for the first time, they were both descendants, by the way, of Henry, who killed Peter. But anyways, they were able to take advantage of this. It was divide and rule. They played off different Muslim factions against each other until finally they were able to walk into the city to convince it to surrender.
And the story of the last King of Granada looking behind him and weeping and...
Total invention. Total invention. He wasn't weeping. He got away with a big bag of money.
The Moor's last sigh.
The Moor's last sigh, yeah, was because his money bag was so heavy as he trudged off into the sunset. But this is another interesting myth. Boabdil, the last king, he didn't go back to North Africa when he surrendered Granada to the Catholic kings. They gave him a new kingdom, a little tiny kingdom in the Alpujarras, in the mountains just south of Granada. And so he went there and he was king there for a while, and then he thought, this really isn't worth it. And so then he finally packed up his bags and went to Morocco. So the idea that at this time the Spanish or the Catholic kings were interested in cleansing Spain of Islam is just patently not true.
So what happens to the Muslims and the Jews who remain in southern Spain?
Well, 1492 happens to the Jews. And this is kind of an interesting conundrum. The Jews in Christian Spain had been under pressure for a long time, for a lot of complex reasons. A lot of it was economic. It was Jewish financiers which had provided the loans which allowed Granada to be conquered by the Catholic kings. And the Catholic kings were very tightly involved with the leading Jews of their kingdom. It was another case of political symbiosis. The winds of time were changing, though, and for political and religious reasons, the Catholic kings decided, Isabel anyways, in 1492, that she had to expel the Jews from their lands or convince them to convert. That was basically the end of Judaism in the peninsula. But Islam was a
they
totally
go
different
to
thing.
Salonika, mainly, to Ottoman...
Some went to the Netherlands, most went to Ottoman lands, a lot went to North Africa. These were Jews who were more acclimatized to the Arabo-Islamic world, felt more connected with it, felt more at home there.
And there's a whole tradition of song and poetry that they take with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The whole Sephardic tradition, Ladino, the old Spanish that they spoke in the 16th and 15th century. I believe in Istanbul there might still be one functioning Ladino newspaper that's published in that language, although I think it's gone down to one edition a week.
And again, we have this image so often in the West, certainly, of Islam as being this sort of, barbarous and cruel land, but having thrown the Jews out of Spain, they go to Salonika. Who finishes them off? Of course, it's the next time Western European Christians turn up in the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
And the Jews of Salonika are sent off to Auschwitz.
Absolutely. This is another one of our great kind of presentist distortions of history. If I ask my students today, where did Jews do better, in the Christian world or the Islamic world? Almost, 90% will say they did better in the Christian world. But if you look at the history of the matter, it was the Islamic world that not only incubated Jewish culture as it is today, but also preserved it. And I think everything that happened subsequently really began in the age of nationalism from the mid-19th century. So this is an anomaly. It's an anomaly.
So the Jews have gone, but quite a few Muslims remain.
Absolutely.
As Muslims, or they have to convert, or what's the deal?
There had been, since the Christians began conquering Islamic Spain around the time of the Cid, so around the year 1100, and the end game was never to expel the Muslims. You don't want to expel the Muslims for the same reason the Muslims didn't want to expel Christians when they conquered Al-Andalus, because you need people. If you don't have people, you don't have an economy, there's no one paying the taxes. So the Christians did everything they could to keep Muslims living where they lived. They gave them not equal status under law, because nobody got that, but they made them constitutionally established legitimate members of the society. And so all over Christian Spain, there were significant populations of Muslims who were living there until the 1500s.
And just to cut away from the end story, just briefly, so a place, so right back in further north, places like Toledo, you're beginning to get translations of Arabic manuscripts into Latin.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is the next phase. As I said, when the Christians conquered Al-Andalus. Just as when the Muslims conquered places like Persia or the Roman lands, they knew that the culture there was valuable. The Christian kings did too. And so they engaged in processes of translation and synthesis of all of the knowledge that they encountered. Processes which involved the collaboration of Christians, Muslims, and Jews as intellectuals.
There's a guy called Ghalib the Mozarab who acts as the translator.
Well, there's a whole
Toledo,
there's a whole ton of them. There's a whole ton of them. It's this broad project which is happening not just in Toledo but across the peninsula. In fact, one of the first medical schools that was founded in Spain was a Muslim-style medical school staffed and led by Muslim faculty, but it was founded in Christian-conquered Spain.
And the other thing that is happening in the background to all this is that colleges, the idea of universities, which starts in Al-Azhar in Cairo, spreads along North Africa to Morocco, spreads up Spain, and the earliest universities in the West are those nearest the Islamic world, like Paris, and then ultimately Oxford.
Exactly. It's part of a larger culture of the West. When I think about Western culture, I don't think about European culture. I think of this broad band of civilizations and societies, which again stretches basically from the Indus to the Atlantic, and which engulfs Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, be it European, Western Asian, and North African.
So again, so the final stages now of what happens to the Muslims of Spain.
Two things kind of spell the doom of the Muslims in Spain. One of these is a series of revolts in Granada. When the Catholic kings conquered Granada, they made a series of treaties with the Muslims who lived there. But those treaties soon came to be violated by the colonizers that came. So there was an increasing tension that very quickly led to revolt. The revolts were brutally put down. This was also the moment when, Ferdinand and Isabel were wonderful kings, from a kingly perspective anyways, except they failed in the most important thing that kings do, which they didn't produce a male heir who lived. And so as a consequence of that, a new ruling family came to Spain in the 1500s, the Habsburgs. This was the family that controlled the Holy Roman Empire and much of Europe. Very powerful family. It was basically a semi-global dominion, okay? And so when this uprising happened in Granada, the Habsburgs had the wherewithal to come in and crush it. And the offer they made to the people who rebelled against them was convert or die. And so this precipitated a mass conversion in Granada. 50 years later, they decided to force the rest of the Muslims to convert to Christianity also.
But secret Muslims remain, and they turn up rather surprisingly in Cervantes.
Absolutely. This is the thing. There's a dictum in Islam, in the Quran, which says there is no compulsion in religion. You can't force people to convert. And the reason for that, it's an ideal, but it's also a practical thing. You can't really change people's minds. If people convert to a religion, it has to come from within. And so what happened was when they ordered the Muslims of Spain to convert to Christianity, just as it happened with the Jews earlier, they outwardly did, right? But inwardly, a lot of them maintained their Islamic faith, particularly in the countryside. Interestingly enough, sometimes the local Christian authorities were happy to allow them to continue practice as Muslims. One of the most fascinating things that happened, though, was a kind of religious synthesis. These Muslims, after their forced conversion, were known as Moriscos, by the way. And an interesting thing happened with the Moriscos. So they were Muslims who were forced to become Christians. And so what they did was they went to the one sort of midpoint between Christianity and Islam, which was becoming very popular in Christian Spain at the time, which was the adoration of the Virgin Mary. Okay? Jesus is, of course, a prophet in Islam. Mary is regarded as the mother of a prophet.
And Mary appears more often in the Quran than she does in the Bible.
She is the only woman whose name is named in the Quran, and she has an entire surah dedicated to her. And so the Moriscos channeled their religiosity towards Marianism, the worship of Mary. And this became a kind of middle ground for Muslims and Christians in the peninsula.
And where do they turn up in Cervantes?
Well, Cervantes is riddled with... Cervantes' book, Don Quixote, of course, was allegedly dictated to him by a Muslim. This is all this sort of fictional thing that Cervantes built around
the meta story.
Yeah. Exactly. The frame tale, right? which again is a Western Asian, South Asian invention which comes to the West. And it reflects this
like Vyasa and the Mahabharata.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, right down to Canterbury Tales, right?
Right.
And it reflects this atmosphere in which, there's a sort of tragedy to the Morisco story, because the Moriscos were forced to become Christian, right? Some of them did, some of them even came to believe in Christianity, but they knew that underlying it, there was a sense that they would never be fully Christian. They would never be regarded as Spanish. And they took this really to heart. And there were Morisco intellectuals who wrote tracts saying, look, we are loyal Spaniards. Arabs have been Christians since the time of Jesus. Arabic is a language which is as old as Latin. Why aren't we treated as equals? Right? And it was prophetic in a way, because by the time we get to the 1600s, the Spanish had decided that even though these people had been Christian for 3 generations, they were not newcomers. Genetically, they were Spanish. They were not the descendants of North Africans. They were the descendants of the Christians who had converted to Islam and then had converted to Christian. Even so, they decided they must go. 1609 to 1614, a organized, bureaucratic, methodological expulsion of all of the descendants of Muslims in Spain.
And is the Inquisition involved in this, or is this mainly aimed at Jews?
The Inquisition could only go after Christians. So this was the irony. Until they were forced to convert to Christianity, the Muslims were safe from the Inquisition. Once they became Moriscos, then the Inquisition could target them. And this was part of it. And it's interesting because they floated a whole bunch of different plans. One plan was to put all the Muslims in boats and take them out to sea and sink the boats. The other was to send them to Canada. I'm not kidding you. Yeah, to Newfoundland and just leave them there. Right? And then finally they decided the most humane thing would be simply to deport them all to North Africa. And that's what they did. So really it's one of the, more so than in the cases of the Jews, because the Jews were allowed to convert and stay. Right? Muslims, the former Muslims were not allowed to stay under any circumstances. So really it was one of the first instances of ethnic cleansing. And I think it's important because I think this is the moment when racism really starts coalescing. There's not the same racism or idea of racism previously in European society, but this is the moment when racism and nationalism and ethno-religious nationalism start to coalesce and then will blossom in the 19th century.
So you've painted this picture of really 500 years of syncretism and sharing, very much like in this country again, where there's this, these mixed cultures. But when you go to Spain today and you look at any of the lovely paradors, there is the picture of Santiago, the Moor killer.
Yes. It's curious, it's a difficult history to deal with. You see Santiago the Moor killer. On the other hand, every town in Spain, in its tourist literature, presents itself as the town of 3 religions. And they'll have something Jewish, something Muslim there to show you that, Spain was the land of tolerance. I think the important thing to remember is that when we look at history and we look at culture and we look at societies is that however tempting it may be, we can't take power out of the equation. There are always relationships of power which are framing these societies. And we can't forget them. We can't get distracted by the glories of these civilizations and forget that underlying perhaps any political system, there's the implicit or explicit threat of violence always.
Finally, just to bring it back to India again, a lot of the library in the Alhambra ends up in Patna. Do you know that story? No.
Yeah. No, I don't. In Patna.
So Patna, the big library in Patna, has got, I can't remember whether it's 100 volumes from the Alhambra library, but it ends up in Bihar, of all places. Just
Go figure. Well, the Arabic collection in the Escorial did not come from Al-Andalus. It actually came from Morocco. The Moroccan king had put his library on a ship to transport it, and the Spanish captured it and took it. So, such is the way of the world.
We have time for 5 minutes of questions. This lady in the front. Is there a microphone?
Thank you so much for that talk, Brian. One of the appeals of your book is not only debunking stereotypes and broad brushing, the clash of civilizations, but also the connect to the present. So as a historian, would you say that there are some lessons from the past that we can superimpose now, especially at this point in time? Thank you.
Well, I think if there were no lessons, then it would be pointless doing history. It would become trivia. But I think we have to be careful because the world then is not the world today. And as I said, these relationships that we see were always relationships of power. And I think one fundamental change is, and this is why I don't get too nostalgic about Al-Andalus, is that today we tend to think of freedom in terms of the individual, whereas then they thought of freedom in terms of the community. So freedom was the possibility for a community to survive, and that is not necessarily compatible with individual freedom, and vice versa. So lessons, but careful.
Gentleman behind. Yep.
Thank you. Going back to the early period which you talked about, after the conquest of Spain by the Arabs, the Umayyads lost Damascus. They were massacred by the Abbasids, and Abd al-Rahman came across, and the Umayyads continued in Spain, basically.
Yeah.
So
the refugee prince.
yes, exactly. So was there a period when, because they were not lost between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. So was there a period where this flow of culture and knowledge across to Spain and Europe was hindered for a while before this happened?
You know, what saved the Umayyads in Spain was the Abbasids were so far away they couldn't do anything. And the other thing that the Umayyads were careful of, even though Abd al-Rahman ad-Dakhil had been the grandson of a caliph, he never claimed the title of caliph. He didn't say, I'm caliph. He said, I'm just a prince. And that way he didn't challenge the authority of the figurehead in Baghdad, which everyone in the Muslim world had to acknowledge. So it played very well.
One last question here.
Quickly, regarding the Battle of Poitiers, or the Tours, which is at the beginning.
Yes.
Was that the last push to conquer Europe, Northern Europe? What was the reason for losing the battle?
It wasn't a push to conquer Europe. It was a raid gone wrong. They were setting out to attack the Church of Saint Denis because they knew there would be lots of gold and jewels there. Okay, and the army had been very successful on the way up, and they got a little bit sloppy, and they got massacred. And it was a cost benefit. Too few of them to risk further expansion for raiding. Better to pull back and consolidate. There was no invasion of Europe because there was no Europe.
There was nothing much to plunder. Anyway, please, a big round of applause for the amazing Brian Catlos.
A huge thank you to Brian Catlos and our festival director, William Dalrymple, for a riveting conversation. Both, as William just said, both Brian and William will be signing copies of their book outside the Durbar Hall at the book signing desk. So please do take this opportunity to go and get the book. Thank you. This session was presented to you by the Aga Khan Foundation. Thank you.